The chapel of Raxenham was full to the doors on the morning she was meant to marry a man she had never once been permitted to refuse. Snow had fallen in the night and lay unbroken on the churchyard yews, and the light through the tall east window was the pale gold of a winter that had not yet decided to be kind. Eleanor Hartley stood in the vestry in a gown the color of curdled cream, her gloved hands folded because she had been told that a bride's hands must be still, and she listened to the organ find its first note and understood, with a calm that frightened her, that she did not intend to walk out of that door as promised. She was 23, and for the better part of a year she had belonged to other people's plans. Her father had died in the spring, owing money to men who did not send flowers, and the house on Cavendish Row had been sold with the pianoforte still in it, and Eleanor had been received into the household of her aunt, Lady Marcham, the way one receives a debt one intends to collect. The arrangement had been made almost before the earth on the grave had settled. She would marry, Mr. Dack said, Julian Ashby, who had capital and wanted connection, and Lady Marcham would be paid for the trouble of producing her, and everyone would be satisfied, except the girl in the middle whose satisfaction had never once been asked for. You may think a woman in such a position had no choice at all, and for a long while Eleanor had thought so too. Stay with her a moment. In the vestry there was a second door, low and plain, that gave onto the passage the servants used, and beside it on a peg hung a grey wool cloak, heavy and unlovely, the sort a housemaid wore to cross a wet yard. Eleanor had noticed it when she came in. She had noticed it the way a drowning person notices a spar. Now while the organ swelled and Lady Marcham's voice came sharp through the wall arranging the placement of guests, she crossed the little room and lifted the cloak from its peg, and felt the honest weight of it settle on her shoulders. And it was warmer than anything she had worn in a 12-month. The cream gown vanished under the grey. So did the bride. What remained, to any eye that did not trouble to look closely, was a servant girl on an errand, and no one in Raxenham had troubled to look closely at a servant girl in living memory. At the head of the chapel, where the great families sat in their pews like a jury already decided, the Earl of Harrowgate had come, because he could not decently refuse the invitation, and he was sorry that he had come. Marcus Renfield was 32, and he wore mourning still under his dark blue coat, though the year for it was past, and he sat with the stillness of a man who has learned that stillness costs less than anything else. He had known the Hartleys slightly once, in the years before his own house went quiet. He had come to see the daughter married off, and he found the whole business distasteful in a way he could not have named to a soul, and he was watching the vestry door for the bride when the low servants' door across the transept opened instead, and a girl in a grey cloak slipped out and did not look back. He knew her at once. That was the thing he could not afterward explain. The cloak was wrong, and the exit was wrong, and the whole shape of it was wrong. And still he knew the set of her shoulders under the coarse wool, and he felt something in his chest turn over that he had believed permanently stilled. Eleanor went out through the churchyard the way the servants went, past the shed where the sexton kept his tools, and the snow came through the worn heels of her slippers, and she did not care. She had 6 shillings in a knotted handkerchief, which was every coin she owned in the world, and no plan beyond the next hedge. She had told no one. There was no one to tell. That was the whole cruelty of her situation rendered into a single fact. She carried it out of the churchyard like a stone in her pocket. Behind her, the organ played on for a while, expecting a bride. The road from Raxenham ran north between stone walls, and Eleanor walked it with her head down, and the grey hood drawn forward, and she did the arithmetic of the desperate. 6 shillings would buy her 3 nights of a bed and bread, if she was careful, 4 if she was frightened enough to be very careful. She had no character reference, no family that would own her, no skill that a great house paid for beyond the ordinary accomplishments of a gentlewoman, which the world did not pay for at all. What she had was the memory of her father teaching her to keep his ledgers, when her hands were still too small for the pen, and a clear, hard head for figures that no one had ever thought to want, and a refusal, arrived at that morning under an organ's first note, to be spent like coin for someone else's comfort. To Lady Marcham she had been, from the first day, a liability with a pretty face, Eleanor had heard the phrase through a door on her third evening under that roof, spoken to the housekeeper over the ordering of linens, in the tone one used for arranging the disposal of furniture. A liability with a pretty face and a temper besides, and no gratitude in her for all the trouble. Eleanor had stood in the passage with a candle going soft in her hand, and listened to herself described as a sum to be recovered, and had not wept, because weeping was one more thing that would be counted against her. The words had lodged where such words lodge. She had carried them through the fittings and the dinners and the long, silent carriage rides. Carried them so long, she had half begun to believe them a fair account of what she was. She thought of them now on the open road, with the wind finding every gap in the gray wool, and found that she did not any longer believe them. That was new. That had arrived that morning under the organ's first note, and had not left her. A liability did not walk 3 miles into a snowstorm on 6 shillings for the sake of owning her own next hour. A liability stayed where she was put and let herself be spent. Whatever she was, cold and friendless in a borrowed cloak, she was not that. Snow began again, toward noon, fine and steady, and the walls gave out and the road ran open across a common where the wind had teeth. Eleanor's cream skirts, wet to the knee under the cloak, dragged at her like hands. She was cold in a way that had stopped being a sensation and become a fact about the world. And she heard behind her the sound she had been dreading since the churchyard, the sound of a horse ridden at speed on a bad road, and she stepped off into the ditch and drew the hood close and prayed to be a servant, invisible, beneath anyone's notice. The horse slowed, the horse stopped. She looked up because there was nothing else to do, and the Earl of Harrogate sat above her against the falling snow. And his face was not the face of a man who has caught a runaway. It was the face of a man who has found something he was afraid he had imagined. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice was low and level, and it did not carry an ounce of triumph in it. "You will freeze." "I am a servant on an errand, sir," she said, and lifted her chin inside the hood. "You have mistaken me." "I have not mistaken you in my life," he said. Which was a strange thing to say to a woman he had spoken to perhaps 4 times, and stranger still because he seemed to know it was strange, and to mean it. Anyway, he did not seize her, he did not command her back. He swung down from the horse into the snow, so that he stood in the ditch at her level, a great cold earl to his boot-tops in a common ditch, and he unclasped his own dark coat and held it out, and when she did not take it, he set it about the gray cloak's shoulders with the plainness of a man laying a blanket on a horse he valued. Then he said the first of the commands she would learn to hear the truth beneath. "Come out of the water." She came out of the water, not because he had ordered it, because for the first time in a year someone had looked at her and seen a person cold enough to die, and it undid something in her that a gentler word could not have reached. He did not take her back to Wrexham. She had braced for that, had a refusal ready and sharp as a pin, and never needed it. He took her instead to the house of his old nurse, a Mrs. Bellamy, who kept a clean cottage at the edge of his lands 3 miles north, a widow with a fire always lit, and a way of asking no questions that were not hers to ask. He set Eleanor down at that fire, and spoke 6 words to the old woman, and rode away into the snow, without once suggesting that Eleanor owed him thanks, or an explanation, or her return. She is cold. She is not to be discussed. Mrs. Blex Bellamy, who had raised the boy who became the Earl, and had buried a good part of her own heart when his young wife died, looked at the girl steaming by her hearth in a servant's cloak over a bride's ruined gown, and drew her own conclusions, and kept them, and put the kettle on. Eleanor slept 11 hours, and woke, not knowing where she was, and for the space of 1 breath believed herself still in the vestry with the organ tuning, and the relief when she remembered was so violent it left her shaking. She was in a low, warm room under a slanted ceiling. Her wet things were dried and folded on a chair. The gray cloak hung by the fire, and beside it, on the same peg, the Earl's dark coat, which he had not asked to have returned. She learned the shape of her rescue slowly from Mrs. Bellamy, who told the truth in small, useful pieces the way one feeds a fire, The Earl of Harrogate had lost his wife 2 years past in the winter of a fever that took her in a single dreadful week while he was in London on business he could not afterward remember the purpose of. He had come home to a house gone silent, and a nursery furnished for a child that would now never fill it, and he had not been the same man since, and the county had decided he was cold, and the county was wrong, and Mrs. Blang. Bellamy would thank a person not to repeat that she had said so. "They call him hard," the old woman said, turning a griddle cake. "He is not hard, he is careful. There is a difference, though the difference costs him, for the world reads care as coldness and rewards a warm liar over an honest, quiet man every day of the week." Eleanor sat with that. She knew something of being read wrong. She had been read wrong her whole life by people confident in the reading. To the county she was already a scandal with a name attached. Word travels faster than snow melts. By the second day, the country round Wraxenham had settled its verdict, and the verdict was voiced at Lady Marcham's own table that evening, over a dinner she gave precisely so that it might be voiced, and she might be seen to grieve it. "An ungrateful girl who ran from her own wedding," Lady Marcham told her guests, dabbing at a dry eye. "A liability with a pretty face, as I always said. She has shamed us, and after everything. I wash my hands," the guests murmured. The rival for the county's sympathy. A Miss Cassandra Vane, who had wanted Mr. Rax, Ashby's capital for herself, and now saw her road cleared, agreed that it was very shocking and thought privately that a girl who had run in a servant's cloak had never deserved a gown. None of which reached the cottage where Eleanor was slowly, warily becoming herself again. She helped Mrs. Bellamy because she could not sit idle and be fed. She learned the geography of the small clean rooms, the loose board by the dresser, the way the fire wanted feeding at the left and not the right, the hens that had to be talked to before they would give up their eggs. She swept and scoured and carried water from the well until her hands, soft from a year of being a decoration, hardened. Honestly, Mrs. Bellamy watched her at it and said little, and once, only once said, "You were not raised to this," and Eleanor answered, "No. I was raised to be sold. This is better." And the old woman laughed a short, surprised laugh and did not press her further. She discovered the old woman's small accounts were kept in her head and going wrong. A shilling short here and a reckoning muddled there. The butcher paid twice 1 month, and not at all the next. She sat at the scrubbed table with a stub of pencil and a torn half-sheet, and set them right in an afternoon, ruling her columns straight, without a rule, carrying her sums down the page in the clear, improving hand her father had drilled into her across 100 winter evenings. She found the doubled payment. She found the missing one. She set the whole tangled year of a widow's spending into 4 neat columns that balanced to the farthing, and did it so quickly and so plainly that Mrs. Bissonage— Bellamy watched her hands the way one watches a conjurer. It was nothing. It was the one thing Eleanor could do that the world had never wanted. She did not know that the Earl, calling on his old nurse 3 days after the snow, would find those figures on the kitchen table in a clear, educated hand, and would understand from them something the girl herself had stopped believing. He came on the 4th day. And the 5th. He did not court her, for a runaway bride under his protection could not be courted without ruining her twice over. And he knew it, and the knowledge lived in every careful inch he kept between them. He came ostensibly to see Mrs. Bellamy. He sat by the fire and spoke of the weather and the roads, and he watched Eleanor's hands when she mended, and once when she reached past him to set a cup on the mantel and her sleeve fell back. He saw the chilblains on her wrist from the walk through the snow, the raw, broken skin of a gentlewoman who had crossed a common on foot. And something moved across his face, and was gone before she could name it. "You will wear gloves out of doors," he said. Not a request. A command, level and low. The second she would learn to hear beneath. "I have no gloves fit for out of doors, my lord," she said, and did not soften it, because she had done with softening things for the comfort of people who held her fate. "I have 6 shillings and a borrowed cloak. Gloves are not among my present arrangements." He was quiet a moment. Then so plainly it took her a breath to feel the weight of it, he said, "That will be seen to," and looked into the fire as though he had said nothing at all, and the raw wrist was never mentioned between them again. But a pair of good grey gloves appeared in the cottage 2 mornings later, wrapped in plain paper, with no card. This is the part of the story where you might expect a rescue to arrive. On schedule, a proposal, a settlement, the machinery of a happy ending, oiled and turning. It did not arrive. What arrived instead was Mr. K. Julian Ashby, who did not care to be jilted, and cared very much to be repaid, for the marriage had been more than a marriage. Eleanor learned this from the Earl himself, who told her because he judged she had the head to bear the truth and the right to know the shape of the trap she had run from. Her father's debts had not died with him. Lady Marcham had bought them. She had bought the whole of the paper on the Hartley estate, quietly, through an agent, in the weeks after the funeral, and she had done it because a girl with debts is a girl who can be sold to clear them, and Mr. Planks Ashby had agreed to marry Eleanor precisely on condition that the marriage cancel the sum. Eleanor's flight had unmade the bargain. The debt stood again, live and whole, and it stood against Eleanor. And Lady Marcham held it, and Mr. Fertingen. Ashby, humiliated before the county, had bought a half-share of it out of pure spite, so that he might have the pleasure of calling it in. "You are telling me," Eleanor said slowly, in the cottage with the accounts she had mended still on the table between them, "that by leaving I did not escape the debt. I became it." "I am telling you what they intend," the Earl said, "not what will occur. You cannot buy me out of it, my lord." She said it before he could offer, because she had seen the offer forming. And she would not have it. "I will not be bought clear by one man to spare being bought by another. I have had a year of being an amount of money with a face. I would sooner keep the debt and my name than lose the name to keep the man's roof." He looked at her then the way he had looked at her in the ditch, as though she had confirmed something he had staked a private hope upon. "I had not the smallest intention of buying you," he said. "I have a great deal more respect for you than that. What I intend is to see the paper it is written on." The sum was £1,100. Eleanor knew the figure to the shilling, because she had kept her father's books, and she knew something else that she had carried a year without a soul to tell it to, and now, at last, told. Her father had paid down the greater part of that debt in the last months of his life. She had entered the payments herself, in her own hand, in a ledger that had been in the house on Cavendish Row when it was sold. Sold with the pianoforte, sold with everything, and where the ledger had gone, she did not know. But it had existed. The true debt was not £1,100. It was under 400, and if the payments could be proved, Lady Marcham had bought paper worth a third of what she meant to collect, and had built her whole design on a sum that was mostly already dead. "Then we want the ledger," the Earl said. "It was sold with the house. Houses keep their bones," he said. "The purchaser of Cavendish Row is a Mr. Peabody, a wine merchant, a client of my own solicitor, as it happens. Ledgers are not burned. They are boxed and put in a cellar and forgotten. I will send someone." He sent his steward, a spare grave man named Coombe, to Cavendish Row, and Coombe was a full week about it, and in that week the pressure came down on Eleanor like weather. A letter reached the cottage, forwarded through Lady Marcham's own hand, to be sure Eleanor felt it, informing her that the sum of £1,100 was due, and that in the absence of payment or a resumed engagement, proceedings would be laid before the magistrate that would see her committed for the debt. Committed! The word meant a room with a lock and no window and no leaving, for as long as the debt stood, which for a woman with 6 shillings meant forever. Lady Marcham had not raised her voice once in the whole design. She had simply bought the girl's freedom, now proposed to spend it. Eleanor read the letter twice, and set it down and found her hands were steady, which surprised her, and understood that she had passed some point past which fear could not reach because there was nowhere lower left to go. The Earl was there when the second letter came, the one that named the day. He read it over her shoulder uninvited, and she let him, and she felt the change in him at her back before she heard it in his voice. a stillness gone suddenly to iron. He had held his grief 2 years by being careful. Careful had a limit, and Lady Marcham had just found it. "You will not be committed," he said. "You cannot promise me that, my lord." "I do not promise it. I intend it. There is a difference, though the difference costs." He had heard Mrs. Brodie, Bellamy, say the like of him 100 times, and did not know it, and Eleanor did. And the knowing turned something warm and painful over in her chest. He was closer than propriety allowed. She could feel the cold he had brought in on his coat and, under it, the warmth of him, and she was aware with the body's clean, unarguable honesty of exactly where he stood without turning to look, the way one is aware of a fire in a dark room. His hand had come to rest on the back of her chair, not on her, on the chair, a half-inch of gray wool between his glove and her shoulder, and neither of them moved to close it, and neither moved to widen it, and the fire spoke to itself in the grate for the length of 3 slow breaths. "Why," she said finally, not turning, "are you doing this? You owe the Hartleys nothing. You barely knew my father. You have every reason in the county to leave me to what I have earned by running, and you have a name to protect, and I am a scandal in a borrowed cloak. Why?" She heard him take a breath as though the answer cost him. "Because 2 years ago," he said, low and level, and for the first time not entirely steady, "there was a week when I was elsewhere attending to nothing that mattered, and a woman who was mine to protect wanted help and did not send for me because she thought I would be inconvenienced. And by the time I came home the asking was past, and so was she. I have told myself since that I could not have known. It is true, and it does not help. When I saw you go out that servant's door, I knew you had decided to want nothing from anyone ever again rather than risk being an inconvenience. I have seen that decision made before. I did not reach the last one in time. I have found I cannot sit still and watch a person make it twice. It was the most he had said to her, or to anyone, in 2 years. He did not look for a reply. He straightened and took his hand from the chair, and a half-inch became a yard, and he was the careful Earl again, but something had been set down between them in the firelight that could not be picked back up and carried off. "Chenb, Coombe returns tomorrow," he said with the ledger, "or without it. Either way, you will not go to that magistrate alone." Coombe returned with a wooden box furred in cellar dust, and inside it, among a wine merchant's papers, the Hartley ledgers, 3 of them, the last in a girl's careful, improving hand growing sure down the pages, and in that hand, dated and initialed, and witnessed by a clerk whose name could be found, every payment her father had made against the debt in the last year of his life, £740. The true remaining sum was £360. Lady Marcham had bought a corpse and dressed it as a giant. The magistrate's hearing was set for the Friday in the assembly rooms at Wraxenham because the courthouse roof was being mended, which meant it would be public, which Lady Marcham had arranged with care, for she wished the girl's committal to be witnessed by the same county that had witnessed the shame of the empty chapel. She had built the whole design in the open. She had never once imagined it might be dismantled there. The assembly rooms at Wraxenham were the grandest in the county, high-paneled walls, and a musician's gallery and 3 great chandeliers that on this Friday held no candles, for it was a hearing and not a ball. And the winter light came gray through the tall windows onto a room packed to the walls. They had all come. The county did not miss a spectacle, and this one had a jilted man and a ruined girl and a wronged and grieving aunt, and it promised to end with a lock turned. Miss Cassandra Vane had a seat near the front, and a new bonnet. Mr. Ashby stood with the look of a man about to be paid. Lady Marcham sat in state with her papers and her dry grief, and she watched the door for the girl the way a cat watches a hole. Eleanor came in on no one's arm, in the gray cloak, because it had become hers in a way the cream gown never had, and under it a plain dark dress Mrs. Bellamy had made over, and she was afraid, and she did not show it, and she found the Earl of Harrowgate standing along the side wall where the great family stood, in his dark blue coat, still, watching her come the way he had watched her leave a chapel, by the wrong door, and she took what she needed from the sight of him, and walked to the front alone. The magistrate read the complaint, the sum of £1,100. Lady Marcham's counsel spoke of the paper, well drawn, properly assigned, undisputed. He spoke of the ingratitude of the debtor, the injury to Mr. Cracked. Ashby. The necessity of an example. He asked for committal. It was very smooth. It was the sound of a machine that had never been asked to reverse. "Has the debtor anything to say?" the magistrate asked, in the tone of a man who did not expect she had. "I have, sir," Eleanor said, and her voice did not shake, and she laid the ledgers on the table before him, 3 of them, open to the pages, and she told the room the arithmetic her father had taught her when her hands were too small for the pen. She named the payments, she named the dates. She named the clerk who had witnessed them, who could be sent for, who lived not 4 miles distant. She said the true sum was £360, and not 1 shilling more, and that the paper Lady Marcham held had been bought at full value against a debt 3 parts dead, and that she did not deny the true debt, and would pay it in time, as an honest person pays, but that she would not be committed for £800 of air. The room, which had come to watch a girl locked away, went very quiet, and then began the low collective sound of a verdict changing its mind. Lady Marcham rose. Her counsel put a hand to stay her, and she did not heed it. "This is a fabrication," she said, and her voice, so smooth an hour before, had a crack in it now like the first crack in river ice. "These books are forgeries. The girl kept them herself. She says so. She has forged her own acquittal. I move that the court disregard. The clerk who witnessed the entries is Josiah Trent, of Millbrook. And he is living," said the Earl of Harrogate, and he did not raise his voice, and it carried to the panelled walls all the same, because a room that has decided to listen will hear a quiet man over a loud one. He came off the wall and crossed the floor, not in haste, and stood beside Eleanor at the table before the whole county, which was the one thing his name and his care and his 2 years of careful distance had been holding in reserve. "I have sent for him. He will confirm every hand and date in those books, and I will stand surety this hour for the true sum of £360, that Miss Hartley go free of this room and pay it, as a free woman pays, at her own hand, in her own time." The magistrate looked at the ledgers. He looked at the Earl, whose word in that county was worth more than Lady Marcham's paper, and every candle in the dead chandeliers above them. Then he did the plain thing, the procedural thing that undid the whole design in a sentence, and ordered the complaint amended to the true sum, the committal denied, the surety accepted, and the witness sent for to confirm. It was over that. Quickly. Machinery reversed makes very little noise. Lady Marcham stood a moment longer with her mouth open, on an objection that had nowhere to go, and Miss Vane looked at her new bonnet as though it had been a poor investment, and Mr. Ashby, who had come to be paid, understood that he had bought a half-share of nothing, and would not be thanked for it. And the county, which is only ever a crowd deciding what it always knew, turned its warm attention on the girl in the grey cloak, who had stood alone and told the plain truth in numbers, and found that it had admired her all along. The Earl did not offer Eleanor his arm on the way out. He knew the county was watching, and knew what an arm too soon would cost her, and he had not gone through the whole careful year to spend her reputation in the last 10 feet of it. He walked beside her at a proper distance to the door, and it was distance that meant more than any arm, because she could read now what the distance was for. Outside it had begun, softly to snow. She paid the debt over the spring in true coin. From the first small sum the Earl found honest work for her head to earn, for he had a great estate and books gone tangled since his wife died and no one he trusted to set them straight, and there was nothing improper in a landowner employing a woman of demonstrated skill to order his accounts. Or nothing the county could name, though the county understood perfectly well, and for once approved. She worked in the estate office with the door open, and Mrs. Bellamy, often by the fire, at a broad table by a south window where the light was good, and she found the estate's books in the state of a house whose master had stopped caring what became of it. Rents unreconciled, A bailiff's arithmetic gone quietly wrong, in the bailiff's own favor, whole quarters left unbalanced since the winter the earl's wife died. She set them right the way she set everything right, column by patient column, and in the setting right she came to know the shape of his lands better than he did himself, which fields drained and which did not, which tenant had been overcharged and which undercharged and by how much, and she brought these to him plainly, without softening, because she had learned in the cottage that he preferred the plain thing to the kind one. He took to standing at the window while she worked, not speaking, and then to sitting across the table, and then to asking her judgment on matters he had not asked anyone's judgment on in 2 years. A lease to renew, a cottage to mend, a dispute between tenants that wanted a fair head rather than a title. She gave it plainly, and he took it plainly, and something passed between them each time that was not in the words, an ease, a reliance, the particular warmth of being needed for the one thing one is good at by someone who values it. Once his hand and hers reached the same page at the same moment and stopped an inch apart on the paper, and neither finished the motion, and both looked at the ledger as though the answer were written there, and the clock on the mantel counted out the silence, and the careful distance between them wore thinner by honest degrees, to the thing built rather than declared. It was Mrs. Bellamy who said the thing plainly at last, on an evening in May, when the old woman was leaving, and the Earl was not, and the impropriety of that was suddenly the only fact in the room. "I have kept my counsel a long while," she said from the door, "as I was raised to. But I am old, and I will say this once, and then hold my peace forever. He has not looked at the world with any want in his face for 2 years, Miss Hartley, and he looks at you so, and I would not have either of you careful yourselves into another 2 years of winter, for the sake of what the county thinks. The county is already forgiving you. Forgive yourselves the waiting." And she went out and shut the door and left them, the fire and the silence, and the honest distance grown at last unbearable. He crossed it, not in 3 strides, in 1. He did not make a speech, for he was not a man of speeches, and she would not have believed one. He put his hand at last, where for a season it had rested only on the backs of chairs on her shoulder, and turned her to face him, and looked at her the way he had looked at her in a ditch in the snow and across a hearing room and every careful day between. And he said the plainest true thing he owned. "Stay, not marry me, not I love you." Those would come in their season, said properly and heard gladly. But first the command she had learned all winter, to hear the truth beneath, the one word that held all the others. And this time, she did not mistake it for coldness, and this time she did not walk out any door. "I have nowhere else I wish to go," she said. Which was, for a woman who had once owned 6 shillings and a borrowed cloak, and no place in all the world, the largest thing she had ever been able to say, and she said it with her whole heart, and he heard it whole. They were married in the autumn, quietly, in the same chapel at Wraxenham, and the county came, and this time no one watched the servants' door, and Eleanor did not once look at it, for she had no further use for that particular exit. She wore no cream gown. She wore soft green, the color of a spring she had earned her way into, and when the organ found its first note she did not flinch from it, and Marcus Renfield watched her come up the aisle, on no one's arm but her own, until she reached him and took his freely, which was the whole difference and the whole of the story. The gray cloak she kept. It hung in the estate office by the good gray gloves, honest wool by honest leather, and on cold mornings she wore it still to cross the yard, and the household thought it an eccentricity in a countess, and loved her for it, and only she and the Earl knew what it was, which was the plainest true thing she owned. It was the garment in which she had walked out of a life chosen for her, cold and afraid and owning nothing, and refused to be spent. It had cost her everything she had, and been worth every shilling. On the first snow of their first married winter, she found him at the window of the room that had been a nursery furnished for grief, standing where he used to stand, and she did not speak, only crossed the room the way he had crossed it to her in May in one motion and no hurry, and stood beside him, and put her hand in his. Outside, the snow came down on the yews, unbroken and pale gold. In the last of the light, he had come home once to that window and found the house gone silent. He stood at it now, and the house was not silent. It was only quiet, which is a different thing, as different as care from coldness, as different as being spent from being chosen. "You did not freeze," he said low after a while, which was as near as he came to saying everything. "No," she said. "I was found first, and the snow fell and the fire held, and neither of them, that winter or any after, was ever cold in that house again."